Good evening. My name is Benjamin Wu. I'm the Associate Director of the School of Journalism and Communication and Program Head for Communication and Media Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 14th Annual Attallah Lecture, Between Legacy and Streaming, Mainstreaming Gaze in the 21st Century, to be delivered by our guest, Professor Eve Ng of Ohio University. Before proceeding to the lecture, I want to begin by acknowledging that the land we're gathering on, whether you're here in the room or joining us via live stream, is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I pay my respects and offer our gratitude to elders past, present, and future, the custodians of this land, which has been a meeting place, place for meeting, trade, and communications for millennia. In the School of Journalism and Communication, we always want to pay attention when there is unequal access to the means of communication. With Orange Shirt Day, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, approaching, I encourage all of us who are settlers here tonight to commit to listening to and amplifying the voices of our Indigenous neighbors in the coming days and all year. Now, I'd like to invite my colleague, Ira Wagman, to come up and say a few words about our lecturer's namesake, Paul Attallah.
Thank you. Thanks, and good evening, everybody. I want to thank you, Ben, for asking me to say a few words about Paul Attallah, the person for whom this lecture is named and a person who would be very interested in the topic of tonight's lecture. I worked with Paul for nearly a decade before his passing, and I relish the chance tonight to reflect on his contributions to our field. With these remarks, I'd also like to recognize the passing of two other colleagues within our program, Professor Kirsten Kozelenka and Professor Michael Dorland, both of whom have left us in the time since our last Attallah lecture, both of whom are also sorely missed. Paul Attallah taught in this department for over 20 years after completing a PhD at McGill and after previous teaching postings at the Université de Québec à Montréal and the Université de Montréal. He was also the School of Journalism and Communications Associate Director from 1991 to 2005. He died in 2009 at the age of 54 due to liver cancer. During his career, he authored two textbooks, one in English, the other in French, that were instrumental in the teaching of undergraduate communication studies here in Canada, along with several other articles and book chapters. A lot of the work in those textbooks sprung from Paul's genuine interest in teaching undergraduate students, something that he demonstrated as a fabulous lecturer, leading classes with enthusiasm and a wonderfully approachable style. As my boss and point of contact when I started working here, Paul was a mentor and guide, and our shared interest in television history, the entertainment industries, and cultural policy produced many long conversations that were in many ways somewhat unbalanced. This is because I was the only one doing most of the learning, and I have to say most of the laughing at his sharp observations, his excellent suggestions to improve upon my work, and perhaps most significantly, his biting sense of humor. Paul's research interest reflected a fascination with television. He was keenly interested in the way that television shed light into the role played by audiences in various kinds of communication processes. And he had a keen interest in the forms of address that television makes possible across different generic forms, and that negotiate institutional constraints on the one side and social values and meanings on the other. As my late colleague Michael Dorland once put it, Paul saw the relationship between broadcasters and audiences as a powerfully ethical one, in that the producers of images carried a powerful responsibility to convert their ability to present the world to us, to entertain, to have fun, and to inform in ways that also had to balance their other responsibilities to shareholders, to governments, to citizens, and to advertisers. To make sense of that dynamic required an approach that took the best from political, economic, and cultural studies approaches that were present, weirdly, at odds in many cases at times. This was part of Paul's attempts to speak back to the critical attention, mostly negative, that popular critics and scholars have had with television as an object of scorn, as a problem in need of saving, or as a site for dubious ruminations about mass psychology. Those tendencies came at a cost, namely in appreciating the complexities of the televisual text, particularly those which could be found in the most popular programs. Those tendencies also came through in different kinds of moral panics about the power of television, and they materialized to some degree in the policy frameworks that have directed the shape of the medium in this country. They were also visible in television's institutional dispersal within the academy, as everyone from psychologists to criminologists has something to say about television in the absence of it finding its home in its own department, particularly the case here in Canada. This produced a way of talking about television, discourse about television as a medium to be acted upon rather than as something deserving appreciation on its own terms. At a time when we have more forms of television on more screens than ever before, I mean, they call it YouTube for a reason, Paul's interest in television has long been an inspiration to my own work. The many books that make up his extensive library on the subject live on in my office. Now, his gift to me when he stepped away from the profession, and a reminder of his contributions to our field. When I consider the topic of tonight's lecture, one which situates the mainstreaming of LGBT content against the backdrop of transformations in the television business, convergence culture, the power of fan communities, and the historical influence of cable television, it's easy to imagine how Paul would have relished the opportunity to be here, to learn from tonight's speaker, Professor Eve Ung, and to be part of the many conversations that will spring from tonight's proceedings. We are grateful to Paul's family for allowing us to offer Paul with this lecture, and we are grateful to Dr. Ung for agreeing to deliver this, the 14th edition. You know what? Let's call it the 14th episode in the captivating and must-see television series that we like to call the Attallah Lecture. Thanks very much.
A couple of quick notes before we move on. I have to say that I'm here to say that the Attallah Lecture is supported by the School of Journalism and Communications Kesterton Endowment, and we also received in-kind and logistical support from the Office of the Dean of the Faculty of Public Affairs. Thank you to FPA's Communications Team Lead, Karen Kelly, and Events Coordinator, Moira McGrath. We're also very appreciative of Carleton University Event Support and Conference Services, who are handling our audiovisual needs and physical setup, respectively. I want to take a moment to acknowledge my predecessor as program head for comms, Josh Greenberg, who put this year's lecture in motion during his tenure. Roger Martin designed our beautiful poster. And finally, I want to thank my assistant, Laura Garreau, without whose work tonight's event would not be possible. Okay, in a moment, I'm going to invite my colleague, Rena Bivens, to come to the stage and introduce Professor Ung formally. She will then deliver her lecture, and we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. As you can see, there are microphones posted in the aisles. When time comes for that, you can line up to ask any questions that you have. And we'll also be taking questions from the online participants in the webinar, and I will be reading those as they come in. Rena, please.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you had a lot of nice food to eat. Thank you, Laura, for that. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Eve Ung. Dr. Ung began her academic career in Australia at the University of Melbourne, where she earned a bachelor degree in both arts and science. She comes to us today having completed 2 other degrees, a PhD in linguistics and a PhD in communication. Dr. Ung is now an associate professor and the graduate director of the School of Media, Arts, and Studies at Ohio University. This semester, I am very lucky to be teaching the doctoral seminar, and we read one of Dr. Ung's books just this week. It was her second most recent book, which came out last year. The book is called Cancel Culture, A Critical Analysis. While this book shows us how important it is to situate canceling practices within their local geopolitical context, Dr. Ung also demonstrates how vital it is for us to invest in global perspectives and transnational encounters when we explore the topics that we are passionate about. The relationship between nationhood, digital media, and cancel culture depends on which cases we are examining and where we look for them in the world. This sparked really interesting discussions in our class on Monday as we contemplated how power dynamics shift the nature of canceling practices and their targets. Dr. Ung is involved in many important conversations in the field of communication and media studies. She has served on several groups and committees for the International Communication Association, including previously acting as the co-chair of the LGBTQ Studies Interest Group and organizing pre-conferences on topics like scholarship in exile and one that should be familiar to many in this room, #CommunicationSoWhite. Dr. Ung is also the associate editor for Communication, Culture, and Critique, and on the editorial board of the Journal of Lesbian Studies, Television and New Media, and Transformative Works and Cultures. So if you're someone who likes to take part in important conversations, maybe you've already heard that Dr. Ung has issued a call for papers for an upcoming special issue of Popular Culture on the topic of queer women's fandom, new global perspectives. That sounds amazing. So if you haven't already heard about this, here's a pro tip. The deadline is coming up soon, October 15th. Please get writing. Dr. Ung is also an award-winning scholar, most recently for her co-edited special issue in Communication, Culture, and Critique on the topic of centering women on post-2010 Chinese TV. The British Association of Film, Television, and Screen Studies named it this year's Best Edited Collection. So go check that out too. The judges noted that discussion of Chinese television is still too rare in academia, even though the Chinese film scene now overshadows Hollywood as the world's largest film market. Now, alongside publishing many fascinating articles that deal with all the important stuff like queerness, class, race, gender, media production, fandom, and so much more, not to mention 2 articles looking at Gentleman Jack. Two. Like, be still my heart. Yes, I'm a fan. I won't confirm or deny whether I was Ann Lister for Halloween last year. Who knows? But we all also benefit from the fact that Dr. Ung takes the time to speak about her work with journalists and other scholars in the mainstream press, on podcasts, and of course on YouTube. After tonight, when you inevitably find yourself wanting to learn more and think with Dr. Ung and her brilliant analyses, head over to her website where you can find her discussing a wide range of topics, from cancel culture and its impact in the classroom and the courtroom, to queer representation in the media. Think Scooby-Doo here. To gay fandom on TikTok. Any Addison Rae fans in the room? To queer baiting, hi Ariana Grande, to political activism by K-pop fans. Remember how they impacted that Trump rally? And the Chinese government's restrictions on pop idol shows in the wake of tightening regulations over gender performance, or so-called soft masculinity. Yeah, she's got her finger on the pulse. So let's have her take it away and speak to us about her most recent book that came out just this year. The title of her talk is Between Legacy and Streaming, Mainstreaming Gays in the 21st Century. Now please help me welcome Dr. Eve Ung to the stage.
Still old school paper. Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, and also to you, Ben. I know that Ben already mentioned this, but I want to thank Josh Greenberg, the former director of the school, who first invited me to give the Attallah lecture, and to Ben and Laura especially for all the logistical stuff that came afterwards. I'm super, super honored to give this lecture, and even more delighted to do so for an academic unit that is so richly, deeply steeped in critical scholarship, including, of course, the late Paul Attallah. So I hope that my talk, in its own way, will contribute to all the conversations you're already having about media, culture, and power. My book didn't just come out this year, it just came out this month. So this is actually the first opportunity I've had to talk about it. So I might be a bit ambitious in terms of the descriptive detail I want to get through as well as the big picture, but let's just see how I go. So as the title of the talk suggests, an overarching topic concerns mainstreaming gays, referring to the mainstreaming of both LGBTQ content and LGBTQ producers. Research that I conducted at the Bravo and Logo, Bravo and Logo networks in the 2000s and 2010s provides data to address this question, illustrating new forms of commercial interest in queer content and its creators. So, what has mainstreaming gays involved? Well, at one level, we could point to prominent series with LGBTQ principles, Queer Eye on Bravo, RuPaul's Drag Race on Logo. Also worth noting are people like Andy Cohen at Bravo. These are LGBTQ identified executives. He's still at Bravo. Lisa Sherman, who was for several years the general manager of Logo from the time of its inception. What I'm particularly interested in are an overlapping set of developments tied to the rise of digital media, including multi-platform programming strategies, and new incorporations of commercial media into commercial media of producers from domains including queer fandoms and independent LGBTQ media. These developments are significant for bridging the legacy and streaming eras, constituting much of the ground for what we see now for LGBT content and interaction online. They also provide a lens on how media cultures change, reflecting and comprising broader socio-political trends. What I hope will be apparent from my presentation is that it's not about simple commercial cooptation of subcultural energies, but nor is it about unproblematic integration and linear progress. Rather, there are mixed outcomes for queer expression and queer agency, which help us deconstruct notions of a monolithic mainstream and allow more complex, I hope, theorizations. So I draw on and draw together several bodies of literature. An important one is the framework of convergent culture. As elaborated by Henry Jenkins, this includes reconfigurations of media ownership, the use of multiple platforms, and crucially, changes to earlier boundaries between producer and consumer, facilitating new modes of participation by those who had not previously been central to mainstream media production. Now, there have been various critiques of especially Jenkins's earlier work, that he didn't sufficiently acknowledge the advantages that industry producers have, that he didn't sufficiently recognize how gender and race hierarchies shape which forms of user engagement are favored by commercial media producers. So, see the work of Rukmini Pandey, Suzanne Scott, and others. Still, I found convergence culture a productive framework for conceptualizing how, in a digital era, LGBTQ production, producers, and consumers move towards the center. In so doing, they changed both commercial media and the place of queer content and cultural agents vis-a-vis the mainstream. In talking about mainstreaming gays, I'm also interested in how to theorize the positions of different cultural agents and the media that they produce more broadly. Just a small anecdote. I don't know if you remember in the old days of Facebook where there were these, I don't even know what to call them, but like features of Facebook, and one was called Bits of Flair. Remember? I love Bourdieu so much, I made a Bourdieu head bit of flair. He was my hero. I miss that Facebook. Anyway, his work on the field of cultural production provides a crucial starting point in the ways that it recognized the interactions between different forms of capital that cultural agents have. So I don't know how much you can see that, sorry, it seems kind of small, but it's a simplified version of Bourdieu's diagram from his 1993 book. If you're already really familiar with it, bear with me as I review it quickly. And if you don't know it, Bourdieu in a diagram. So the horizontal axis, oh, I don't have a mouse. Just imagine me pointing. The horizontal axis goes from low economic capital to high economic capital. So low economic capital in this diagram correlates with a small audience and high economic capital with a large audience. The vertical axis goes from low to high symbolic capital, and that's prestige or recognition like industry awards. And then you can see different parts of the field correspond to different configurations of these types of capital. So in the top left-hand corner, this is Bourdieu's representation of 19th century French art world. The top left quadrant, you have art for art's sake. This is art with the highest prestige, but just a small intellectual audience, like the audience that would get it. The bottom left quadrant, that should be labeled Bohemia, like in Rent, also has a small audience, but it has low symbolic capital, like it doesn't get any recognition, has no resources. And then, I'm pointing that way, but anyway, on the right is the domain of high economic capital. And if you look in the bottom left, bottom right quadrant, it's industrial art. It has mass audience, but doesn't earn any elite cultural recognition. This is where a lot of what we might think of as popular culture, this is where it would fall. And then in the top right quadrant is bourgeois art, more or less middlebrow stuff. It's accorded some prestige, but it's not the sanctified real art of the top left quadrant. Now, Bourdieu obviously wasn't writing about digital media, but I see his approach as valuable in representing media production, producers, and texts as constructing a relational space. So cultural agents in their work, differentially positioned, and sometimes moving around in that space, are what constitute the cultural field. So, how could we revise Bourdieu's model to reflect contemporary media, including the characteristics of digital media? And how could we do it by mapping out what mainstreaming gaze looks like? Stay tuned. In a 2018 paper, Al Martin argued for recognizing queer production studies as a distinct subfield, in part because production studies overall hadn't been especially attentive to the specific conditions of queer cultural agents and the production of LGBTQ content. There has, of course, been research on LGBTQ producers before this by scholars such as Lisa Henderson, Catherine Sender, Julia Himberg, and Amar Christian, as well as accounts by Larry Gross, Susanna Danuta Walters, Ron Becker, and others on the increases in mainstream gay and lesbian content in the 1980s and 1990s. My analysis about the industrial integration of LGBTQ workers provides specific insight into how these processes happen, as well as about the trajectory of those workers and the commercial context in which they work. First, I'll say something about the two networks and their linear programming, as some of this set the stage for their digital strategies. After Bravo was acquired by NBC Universal, it underwent a significant rebranding in the early 2000s, moving from its more highbrow arts programming to reality shows, including gay-themed ones like Boy Meets Boy. Some of the contestants aren't actually gay. And then, of course, what became its signature show, Queer Eye. Queer Eye then ushered in an era of what Catherine Sender has called dual casting, programming intended to appeal to both gay men and straight women. Fashion, food, lifestyle reality shows like Project Runway, Top Chef, Workout, that had some gay or lesbian contestants, but where being queer wasn't the focus. Oh, wrong button. The Real Housewives franchise began in 2006, and in many ways redefined Bravo again. While it may seem even more removed from queer content, there's still a focus on lifestyle. And as a Bravo executive commented to me, there's no housewife, quote, who does not have one or several close gay male friends, not one who does not have a hairdresser, a designer, an interior designer, a manny. As for Logo, it was founded as a new cable channel in 2005 under the Viacom umbrella. And its very, very first program was a specially commissioned documentary about LGBTQ media representation called The Evolution Will Be Televised, a riff on The Revolution Will Not Be Televised song. Additional acquired documentaries about the diversity of LGBT communities were featured on the Real Momentum series, so very documentary heavy. But Logo soon discovered that its biggest shows were shows that also attracted straight women, including the stop motion show Rick and Steve, happiest gay couple in the world. Noah's Ark, the first ever scripted show centered on gay African-American men. And I already mentioned RuPaul's Drag Race, which is still on the air, but it moved to VH1 and then to, I think it's on MTV now. So its goal to expand its audience in ways rather comparable to Bravo propelled Logo toward what it internally called gay streaming, something I wrote about in a 2013 article. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time about this, but here's part of an internal document that a Logo executive shared with me. And you can see the categories that are categorized, well, if you can read the very small print, not gay stream versus the ones that are gay stream. I'll just point out that under not gay stream, that very last category is a too gay niche category. Whereas a bunch of gay stream categories aren't explicitly gay at all, like Mean Girls. So gay streaming led Logo to include shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Reno 911, The Sarah Silverman Show, all of which had one regular gay or lesbian character, but who wasn't the actual main character. But it was the reality series, the A-list, that Logo most clearly moved into a Bravo-esque territory with, as you can see from the promotional language, housewives with balls. It was meant to draw a similar audience, or at least some of the same audience as the Real Housewives series on Bravo. Okay, so in terms of a convergence culture framework for my analysis, one element was how both these networks had ambitious aims for multi-platform programming centered on LGBTQ content. So Bravo launched the digital outlet Outzone TV in 2006, and this was at the height of its Queer Eye success. It promised a dazzling mix of subjects and genres, including long and short-form video, historical and contemporary content, LGBT topics and non-LGBT topics. Logo set up, as well as purchased, several LGBTQ-centric sites, as this splash page shows. This is like all of its sites, the ones it set up as well as the ones it bought. I want to highlight just two of these. So after Ellen, about lesbian and bisexual women in popular media, was founded in 2002 and run independently by Sarah Warren until its acquisition by Logo in 2006. it became the network's most successful website in both visitor numbers and recognition. So in 2008, it was named by the Observer newspaper in the UK as one of the world's 50 most powerful blogs. I mean, 49, but still, it made it in. .365Gay, one of the earliest LGBTQ news sites, was founded in 1995 by Canadian journalist Rob Sands in Toronto. And then it was also bought by Logo in 2006. Given where we are, I want to mention that Canada was home to another groundbreaking gay news site in the 1990s, at a time when there were only 4 such sites in the whole world. Gay Ottawa Now, founded by Ottawa resident Darry Maranger, who I thank for sending me the banner and for attending. Thank you. As for the staff of these sites, there have, of course, been queers in media production as far back as early Hollywood. But with Bravo and Logo, especially after Logo's purchase of pre-existing LGBTQ websites, there were multiple LGBTQ cultural agents involved in the commercial production and distribution of LGBTQ media. It wasn't just a gay man making, non-gay stuff. So this is a key way that convergence played out in ways that had not occurred prior. So I want to show you just some illustrative examples of the pathways that contributed to this new cohort of LGBTQ content creators. Okay, let's start with fandom, because I love fandom. I got into communications and media studies through fandom. There, I actually said it. I was telling the grad students I talked with last night that I had this whole thing about how I came to media studies because I loved Buffy. And then I took it out because it didn't seem professional enough, but it was through Buffy. Okay, so for After Ellen, there really wasn't that much to write about on a regular basis back in the early 2000s. Until Sarah Warren caught wind of a Showtime series that would center on a group of lesbian women in LA. At the time, it was called, weirdly, Earthlings, but they thought that sounded too much like sci-fi. So once the L Word began airing, 2004, After Ellen's coverage really put the site on the map because fans flocked to it. Crucially, certain fans became regular contributors to After Ellen and to its brother site, After Elton, which covered gay and bisexual men. So, for example, besides Sarah Warren herself, Sarah Warren recruited a fan called Scribe Girl, as a recapper. Scribe Girl had been recapping for Yahoo and brought her recaps to After Ellen. And as Warren said, this completely blew up the site. Like, it was just so successful. Heather Hogan and the Leinster were readers of the site that would comment quite regularly. The site was looking for more contributors, and so they asked Hogan and the Leinster to submit sample blog posts, and then they became regular contributors as well. And After Elton, the editor noticed someone called Anthony Langford, who would comment also as a fan of soap operas, and then recruited him to write recaps of soap operas for the site. Another major entry point was through independent LGBTQ media. So at 365Gay, the editor, Jay Vanasco, had been on staff for Chicago's Windy Times, independent gay paper. She then found additional contributors through her contacts with others in the gay press. For example, James Withers, he'd been a reporter for the New York Blade. And then for Logo Online, this is a site that Logo set up itself, John Polly, who was the editor-in-chief, described himself as having had, quote, super gay jobs, like forever, because he'd freelanced so much or been on staff for several gay men's magazines before coming to Logo. There were also cases of writers for smaller scale commercial media, like Trish Bendix at After Ellen had written for the lesbian magazine Curve, and then she was recruited because someone else at After Ellen had also worked at Curve. If you want a sense of just how complex this mix of fan, gay print, and other networks looks, here's a diagram from my book that provides a more comprehensive but still only partial representation. I know. I don't know how much you can see. It's probably too small, but it has the sites, it has everyone I interviewed, and then it tries to sort of explain their relationships. And again, it's only partial. But if you're curious, you can look up in the book. With especially Logo looking for a range of LGBTQ content, there were opportunities for queer filmmakers, web series producers, and musicians to have their work featured. So during a peak period of several years, Logo included programming of music videos and short films by queer artists on its channel and on Logo Online via the click list, Top 10 Videos, and the click list, Best in Short Film. It was a major sponsor for New York City's New Fest LGBTQ Film Festival. And then After Ellen especially solicited web series from independent producers, After Elton a bit as well. Artists who provided this content weren't compensated for it. That was the thing. The deal was, you give us our content, we give you the free promotion. So not surprisingly, some LGBTQ artists chose alternative professional routes. One lesbian filmmaker, Tiona McLaughlin, showed her documentary Black Woman at New Fest one year, but she balked at the terms that Logo offered for distributing the film. She opted to distribute it herself. After Ellen did run an article about another documentary that McLaughlin was working on, but apart from that, McLaughlin was someone that engaged with Logo briefly without becoming a content producer for it. So what does all this tell us? Well, one of the key issues about convergence culture has been the extent to which it meaningfully empowers those who were previously industry outsiders, right? As we can see, some of the key actors at Bravo and Logo's websites became paid staff. In some cases, network executives, like Sarah Warren was a Logo executive for the time that she was there. So they moved out of the ranks of media users contributing unpaid labor for commercial media, which is something that people have critiqued. Furthermore, the entry points via queer fandom, independent queer print, and other professional networks of LGBT people were significantly tied to the rise of digital media, alongside the increased centrality of fandom and LGBT content in popular culture. On the other hand, after the first wave of such cultural agents became professionalized at the websites, opportunities for additional outsiders gradually diminished. So instead, site staff began finding contributors through more conventional means, like recommendations from network staff, rather than, what I described before, like recruiting fans because they noticed them posting on the sites. Furthermore, few of Bravo's and Logo's LGBTQ-centric websites endured long-term. Of the ones that I mentioned, Outzone TV was only up for 2 years. 365 Gay closed down in 2011. After Ellen and After Elton actually did attract significant traffic, especially through hosting original video, but it wasn't enough for Logo. So Logo sold off After Ellen to a non-LGBTQ site or a digital media company in 2014, and it folded After Elton into another Logo website in 2015. At one level, these constitute losses. It's a loss of outlets for independent queer producers to distribute their work, a loss of spaces for LGBT users to engage with this media and with each other. And coupled with shifts at the linear channels away from LGBT content front and center, These changes illustrate L. Martin's concept of queer dispersal, where commercial media is quick to shed LGBT content when it's insufficiently profitable. But the websites also helped demonstrate and generate the demand for other original LGBT content in terms of both major commercial media providers and a broad subfield of independent queer production. So first, some of the programming of Bravo and Logo's earlier years have emerged in new forms. I think a lot of us are familiar with the fact that Queer Eye was rebooted by Netflix in 2018 and has enjoyed, I think, both popular and critical acclaim. And then for a show that only lasted 2 seasons, like 20 years ago, Noah's Ark has sustained a passionate fandom. The showrunner Patrick Ian Polk made a one-off program during the pandemic, Noah's Ark, The Rona Chronicles, which is available on YouTube. As for where else we find LGBTQ media now, in terms of the major streaming services, Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, a bunch of others, Max, Peacock, et cetera, none of these, we know, are LGBT-focused. But because they have such large inventories, just having a minority of offerings being LGBTQ-centric is significant for the queer media landscape. And then, of course, there are platforms like YouTube, which is home to a lot of queer bloggers, web series. There's TikTok, Instagram for shorter videos, etc. As Amar Christian has discussed, there have been a range of other sites hosting the work of independent queer producers, sites that arose after the most successful years of Logo's websites, like No More Download for Gay Black News in 2010, Slay TV for series about queer people of color in 2016. Most of these websites didn't last either, but the Open TV platform that Christian himself founded in 2015 supports and streams intersectional pilots and web series. And this site is still up and very active, and it hosts several series centered on queer characters of color. For LGBT news and commentary sites, many, maybe even most of the active ones now have little or no original editorial content. But 3 sites primarily oriented to gay men, founded around the time of Bravo and Logo's sites, are still active. So there's LGBTQ Nation and Queerty, which both belong to the independently owned Q Digital, and then Towel Road, started by Andy Towle in 2003. But unlike After Ellen, After Elton, 365 Gay, these existing sites don't have social media-like features, so they don't provide the same kind of spaces for queer community formation. So at the sites like After Ellen, you could have a user profile, you could have buddies, sort of like Facebook and a bit like Twitter. Because of the constraints of time, I haven't really talked about the importance of the sites as spaces for online interaction, but they were distinct in providing freely available digital arenas for queer user engagement. With the explosion of social media, there of course are now numerous digital spaces, but they're so dispersed, right? They don't offer the same kind of water cooler experience that sites like After Ellen and After Elton did, but especially After Ellen for queer women. There are several smaller commercial streaming services that are only LGBTQ focused. So for English language content, Telefilms was founded in 2007 as a subscription site. It used to be $3.99 a month, now it's $6.99. It's mostly acquired films and acquired TV series, but it's occasionally produced some original content. I don't know if anyone watched the 2019 rom-com Season of Love, but that was Telefilms. Deku is aimed at gay men. That began in 2017, also subscription service. And then perhaps most promisingly, Reverie, Julia Himberg has discussed this recently, was established in 2016 by several queer people of color. And it aims explicitly for diverse intersectional content. Most of its program is short form though, especially the free tier. It has also subscription levels. Looking at where site staff or queer producers ended up gives us other snapshots of the legacies of Bravo and Logo's forays into LGBTQ content. So for example, Zach Hugg was the senior writer for Bravo's Outzone TV. He moved into an executive position at ABC for several years after Outzone shut down, but not LGBT focused. He was the content director for ABC Family. He's now doing freelance writing, some adjunct teaching, not LGBT focused though. Sarah Warren was already working in digital media for Expedia, the travel company, when she founded After Ellen, as she recounted to me in just a few hours one weekend. After she stepped down from Logo, she also took on various non-LGBTQ related positions. While through some analytical lenses, Hugg and Warren illustrate how commercial media absorbed or indeed co-opted queer labor and creativity, I view their trajectories as illustrating what Lisa Henderson theorized as queer relay, something not uncommon for LGBTQ producers. It involves multiple kinds of moves across the mainstream independent spectrum and to different positions within the industry. These cultural agents negotiate the commercial imperatives of their work alongside the political significance of representation for a historically marginalized group, not always landing in the domain of queer media. But sometimes they do. So Tiona McLaughlin is the independent lesbian filmmaker who had screened her work at Newfest, but she was quite critical of Logo, as this interview quote shows. She's actually moved more solidly into the domain of art, this sanctified real art, winning recognition at various major shows like the Whitney Biennial. She's just exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art and so on. And a few others have gone on to other LGBTQ media outlets. So After Ellen editor Heather Hogan was at Autostraddle for many years, but I just read her post yesterday. She has just quit Autostraddle, so she's moving on to other things, but she went from After Ellen to Autostraddle. Okay, so having laid out the various ways that LGBTQ media and its producers shaped Bravo and Logo, I want to return to one of the key goals of my analysis, which is proposing a new model of media production, one that can account for important characteristics of the contemporary landscape. This includes the expansion of LGBTQ content in staking distinction, what Bourdieu had called symbolic capital, and securing profitability, i.e. economic capital, as well as accounting for the multi-platform modes of content delivery, particularly digital platforms that vary in character and scale. When queerness used to be more marginalized, the selective inclusion of LGBTQ content in mainstream media provided a cachet derived from its edginess. But LGBTQ media, from so-called trashy reality shows to acclaimed films and television series, from web series made on a shoestring to Netflix-funded shows, all of these have come to span the cultural field, garnering mixed commercial success and mixed status. Okay, so drawing from the outlines of Bourdieu's model, here's my representation of the field of cultural production as it is now. So if you note the parabolic axis, This includes what Bourdieu had labeled large-scale production, as well as a subfield of low economic capital that nevertheless has large audiences as well. Also, rather than Bourdieu's various subdomains and audience segments, on the right side, you see a space of mass-circulated media. So this is just defined as larger audiences, but not necessarily needing high economic capital and not necessarily having low symbolic capital, like Bourdieu's industrial art had been, but a range of variation for both. What this allows is the representation of conditions where attaining large audiences is not necessarily tied to big budget production, precisely what digital media has enabled. What does it look like when we map media text onto the model? Okay, you ready? Well, it looks something like this. Again, I'm sorry it's so small, but I've put a range of texts and websites and genres with LGBT content positioned in different locations in the cultural field. The websites like After Ellen, Before Purchase, and After Purchase are there. I've put a bunch of different kinds of reality shows that are all, mass-produced but have different levels of symbolic capital and so on. I won't get too much more into the weeds here. Again, read about the details in my book if you like. But the take-home message is that LGBTQ media has become situated across the field of cultural production, associated with varying economic capital, symbolic capital, and audience sizes, with a plethora of options available across different distribution platforms. Digital media also spans the field, from independently produced content and websites to major streamers and their series within mass-circulated media. Bravo and Logo played key roles in bringing some of this media into the major commercial realm through a combination of linear and digital programming and the inclusion of LGBTQ cultural agents to produce it, even though their LGBTQ-centric content has now been eclipsed by what's now available elsewhere. So if we look at the contemporary streaming landscape now, we see the non-linearity of gains and losses. On the one hand, streaming provided or has provided a lot more LGBTQ narratives, including, as this Wired article noted last year, making characters who had been read only as subtextually queer in older texts canonically queer in reboots. So Velma, hooray, in the Trick or Treat Scooby-Doo film on Prime Video. Lewis and Lestat in AMC's Interview with the Vampire series. I mean, they were almost gay in the movie, but not quite. And of course, multiple characters on A League of Their Own, also Prime Video. Yet, with the streamers struggling financially amongst increased competition for subscribers, there have been a plethora of cancellations, right, in the last year or two, especially those with queer girls or women as lead characters, right? Because if you think about dual casting and gay streaming, gay men appeal also to straight women. So, unfortunately, A League of Their Own, the Wired example, is one of these cancellations. And as Alex Krantz noted in his article, Warrior Nun on Netflix, although fan activism has appeared to save this show, supposedly there'll be 3 films. I'm not sure if that will happen, but live in hope. But what observers quickly labeled cancel your gays, saying cancel your gays is the new bury your gays, is part of a larger move away from the kinds of diverse representation that used to be the hook to bring in subscribers, but now in favor of things like, $500 million for the Rings of Power on Amazon Prime. The decision of streamers may be primarily financially driven, but in the last few years, we've also seen a broad swath of attacks on LGBTQ and especially transgender rights and visibility in the US and elsewhere. Indeed, the transgender community has been vulnerable to tensions and fissures within the LGBTQ umbrella as well. So sadly, post-Logo, After Ellen, which is still up, has become best known for its transphobic position, publishing articles like this one about a, quote, butch genocide caused by the trans community. Broader pushbacks against feminist and queer critiques of normative gender and sexuality are now prevalent in the US, epitomized by bills such as Florida's HB 1557, known as the Don't Say Gay bill, which is law now. And these trends are bound up with conservative resistance to critiques of racial inequalities as well. As I note in my book, regressive gender and sexual conservatism isn't confined to the US either. We see discourses and measures, for example, by the Chinese government, as Renee also mentioned, against so-called effeminate men and the homoerotic boys' love or BL genre in China. Bourdieu had discussed conditions where the field of cultural production could become more autonomous from the field of power, politics, for example. But of course, media and culture continue to reflect as well as constitute the complex entanglements of social, economic, and political conditions. But I don't want to end on too somber a note. So returning to where I started, what occurred at Bravo and Logo as a result of the confluence of digital media, fan cultures, and commercial interests in LGBT content remains important, both as a legacy for later integrations of LGBTQ media and cultural agents, and for providing a picture for theorizing how media cultures change through processes that are incomplete and are uneven, but nevertheless leave their mark. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it here, and I welcome your comments. Oh yeah, shameless plug for the book.
So please feel free to line up at either of the microphones to ask a question. And for those of you on the live stream, I'm standing by.
I just want to say thank you so much for an excellent talk, and I really look forward to finishing reading your book.
Thank you.
I am really thinking about this moment of looking at Bravo and Logo in this convergence culture, moving into the digital spaces, really incorporating fandom along with it. And sort of fan-generated content was a massive part of the really elaborate network diagram that you showed us. When we transfer away from this really integrated network model over to streaming platforms, how does the role of fandom change? And is it still as integrated in the platforms when they show some queer content? Or what happens to that sort of queer fandom along the way?
Yeah, thanks for the question. This is where I think a smaller site like After Ellen, like After Elton, really offered opportunities that were distinct for the time period, right? That it was a time when, particular fans, I mean, I don't want to overstate the power of fans. Like I discuss this more in my book, but a lot of the people who set up these websites were already very well positioned. Like coming from Expedia isn't just like I was just a fan watching, in my bedroom. But at the same time, certain fans who are well positioned economically, who had the time to set up websites, could do so. And it was a time where certain other fans could come into commercial production in that way. And that has happened less, right? So if you compare something like After Ellen with a huge streamer like Netflix, there's not that opportunity, right? Because After Ellen had started as an independent site and it only became commercialized because Logo bought it. And then it was, Logo is under Viacom, so it's technically like part of the major commercial media industry that also includes Netflix. But there's not really those avenues for these major streamers. I did mention Reverie because Reverie has been, this is the one that was set up in 2016 by several queer people of color. Reverie has been very explicit that they don't want to become just like another commercial platform. They want to still offer those opportunities. But as people like Sarah Warren would say, where's the business model? Like, how do you keep a site like that alive and still have, original content that isn't only sort of, 6-minute episodes of, web series, which are great, but don't give you that like commercial appeal that a more well-funded series does. So I think my sense is that that's been a loss for fandom for sure.
Hi. Oh, sorry. You mentioned that you got into communications and media through Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is coincidentally how I got into communication. Yes. Shout out Buffering the Vampire Slayer podcast. Anyways, so I was wondering what you thought about Tara and Willow's storyline, particularly how Tara ends up ultimately dying of non-fantastical violence, which is rare in the Buffyverse, and how that kind of theme is seen where like violence and tragedy is put on like femme queer characters.
Yeah, thank you. And now I'm reliving the trauma a bit.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I remember my girlfriend at the time read spoilers, so she knew that Tara would die, and I didn't. She just kept saying, there's something big going to happen. I was like, shut up, shut up. I didn't even want to know that. But yes, like, I think that was an early example of, obviously, a bury the gays storyline that fans were very unhappy about and made known that they were unhappy about it. And look, there are a lot of issues with Joss Whedon now that are unrelated to Buffy, but at the time, he was a beloved showrunner, right? So it was a big shock, and I think that the sort of cruelty of a supernatural show, as you mentioned, is that we see characters come back to life. Like Buffy had come back to life at the beginning of season 6, so it's like, is she really dead? Twice. So, but as you said, being shot with a real bullet and not being, the slayer, it was quite permanent. So yes, those kinds of storylines are problematic. I think that they have still happened. Clexa, for those, Clark and Lexa on the 100, was another queer women's relationship when one of them died of a stray bullet, not aimed for her. So we clearly see those storylines repeating, but I would say that actually post Willow Tara and then especially post Clexa, show producers are much more aware of that trope now and are more careful. I think that's why it's now cancel your gays is the new bury your gays. It's not so much that they kill the characters off, it's just that the shows get cancelled.
Thank you.
Hi, first of all, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. But my question was actually like having a lot to do with the sort of cancel trend that a lot of production companies have taken part in recently, with League of Their Own, Willow, which was a reboot of an older like fantasy movie from like the 90s and featured like a butch Disney princess, which was so crazy. And then they proceeded to cancel and then remove the show from the streaming platform. So I just wanted to know, in your professional opinion, like, do you think that these like cancellations and like especially with what's going on with the strikes and stuff in Hollywood, a lot of writers are asking for like actual information on the ways that they're collecting sort of analytics on these shows, because they claim that there's like no support for these shows, when in reality, if you go on Twitter for 5 minutes and type in the hashtag, like you'll see hundreds and hundreds of fans trying to save their shows. So I was just wondering, like, in your opinion, if this is sort of like an intentional bit on the part of streaming platforms as like a directed towards lesbians like hate campaign sort of, or if it's just like, you know, media being media.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I saw, especially, I was a big Warrior Nuns fan last year and was devastated at the cancellation. So I saw a lot of the discourse that, the mainstream media isn't homophobic, that it's lesbophobic, right? That at the same time that, shows like Red, White and Blue, is that the right order? Red, White and Blue, Young Royals, the shows that center gay men's or boys' relationships have been renewed, that Netflix and other streamers have cancelled shows that center queer women or queer girls as characters, as main characters. Honestly, I think it's a business decision. I think that if those shows made as much money as the other, LGBTQ shows, they would keep them. The data on Twitter is a little bit misleading because they don't care about Twitter engagement so much as are existing subscribers finishing the shows when they start them, and B, to what extent can they bring in new subscribers? That especially is a concern for a lot of them, and so, I was like one of the fans that was like, should I leave Warrior Nun streaming on, 24/7? And then people were like, no, Netflix can tell, like, that what they're looking for is like new people. And I was like, okay, well, that seems useless. So I think that there was a moment where it seemed that all kinds of LGBTQ content, whether it was women, men, trans people, that was edgy, that could draw people in. I mean, let's not forget, like, Netflix's biggest first hit was Orange is the New Black, which is lots of queer women, right? It's not that, and if it could have a show like that again that was sort of zeitgeisty and would bring in the subscribers, I think it would promote it. But part of it is also who are the executives. So you see a lot of turnover at the sort of executive level. I was looking at, was it Prime or Netflix? I think it was Netflix, and a woman whose name I can't remember anymore, had left. She was in like original programming maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. And I was like trying to Google to see if she was a lesbian. She looked like a lesbian. I was like, yeah, because she left, so like maybe that made a difference. Like, people may have personal investments that can push them in certain directions a little bit, not all the way, but maybe those things make a difference too. But now when I look at who's heading those networks, honestly, it looks like a bunch of straight white men. And I think maybe that hurts.
Thank you so much.
Hi. I was just curious about your motivations for this work, because it's really fun to hear about Buffy and about like Warrior Nuns and things like that, and like that you're a fan of these things. So, and also, to be honest, when I saw your logo staff diagram, all I could think about was the L-word relationship chart, and I'm like, what are you channeling here? Like the
what?
The relationship chart on the L-word, like. So like, are you at all motivated by, not just like because you're interested in this stuff, but are you motivated to see, like, if you can understand it more, you can, I don't know, help fans figure out, like, yeah, do I leave it streaming like all night? Like, will that have an impact? Like, is part of this about like, well, now we have this new field of cultural production so we can understand what's going on. Is there a way to exploit that? Like, does that motivate you at all?
Maybe just secondarily. I guess my primary motivation was, like I said, I loved Bourdieu, but I would stare at his diagram. I was like, I can't make it work. I want to make it work for the data I have, but it just doesn't work. And yet, there clearly is a really interesting to me relational way that cultural agents construct the field, right? So how is it that I can, revise or update that diagram to reflect these complexities? And there had already been, as I think I mentioned, and I think a lot of you know, work about how gay content would bring in viewers for mainstream networks who are aiming for like a straight viewership, right? So in the 1990s, Ron Becker was writing about shows like Friends and Seinfeld and Frasier that would have these constant gay jokes. I love Friends. I actually was watching it with my daughter for several seasons until I was like, okay, it's not diverse enough, let's stop. But the constant jokes about, Joey and Chandler, the fact that Ross did have a lesbian ex-wife and she was the butt of the joke. So it was problematic, but it was also, we see that this kind of gay content is being used in mainstream media. It just wasn't being produced by LGBTQ people. So I wanted also to incorporate a model that was like, what does it look like when that content is being produced by LGBTQ people, and not just on the margins, but actually within mainstream commercial media. So whether or not I succeeded with these complex diagrams, I don't know, but I tried to make them complex enough to reflect what I saw, but not so complex that they're illegible, but I'm not sure about the second part yet.
Knowing that the commercial interest, about mainstreaming gays is, going forward, and having seen so much about, the creation of chatbots in the engineering world, do you see any such characters coming out anytime soon into the, whether it's a video streaming or the network takes into the next world for us to,
Wow, that's a great question. I honestly don't know. We saw.
Can you imagine? What character that a new chatbot would likely have?
I don't know. I think isn't the point of generative AI to learn what we like and sort of mold itself to that? So I imagine that, separate from scripted content, but if you're saying if there's a chatbot character or set of characters that are going to be queer, what are they going to be like, and what are the implications for LGBTQ production? That's maybe the next frontier in terms of, hey, great dissertation topic for those of you who are still looking for one.
And if you're ever invited to be playing a role in such a production, would you accept the invitation?
What would I be doing?
Playing a character as a chatbot.
Playing a character? Yeah, sure.
In the direction.
Yeah, I think so. Unless it was going to be used in problematic ways, which maybe it would be. My initial reaction is yes, but contingent.
So that could be as much fun as writing a new book.
Yeah. Thank you.
I was wondering, not used to microphones, I was wondering about your thoughts on just LGBTQ plus representation when it comes to kind of the big elephant in the room in terms of modern media, the most mainstream of mainstream, which is Disney. When you have a giant monolithic media production, I don't even know if company is the right word to describe it anymore. And it owns all these massive franchises, several of which are, have so many decades of previous media, and a lot of them which have a lot of honestly cisgender, heterosexual, white, young, say, or not even young, but male fan bases who push back really strongly against any kind of like, potential queer representation. I'm thinking about conversations in like Marvel fandoms and even in Star Wars fandoms when it's like, oh no, lesbians, that's terrible. And where like there's a lot of these conflicts sometimes where there's subsections of fans that really want positive representation from such a massive monolith and others that push back against it. And then the company itself, which seems to take a bit of a almost milquetoast overall approach to their content. Do you foresee with something as big as that company, could they be changing in the future as we as a society hopefully grow and progress? Or is there just no hope for something that huge compared to the much more grassroots movements that you've been studying?
They've already changed, right? Like they've already changed. The question that came over here about Willow, like to have a Disney, I mean, I know it got cancelled, but there was one season of Willow which had, as you pointed out, a butch, lesbian princess on a Disney show. And this was, a reboot of an older property where there wasn't explicit queerness. Was there dissatisfaction among some of the older queer fans of the older series? Yes, but there was also a lot of support. So the fact that that series could even get made, I think, shows progress. Yes, a lot of what Disney does is horrible and frustrating. The whole like blink and you'll miss it, lesbian or gay couple kissing in the background to, who was it even? Was it Ray? And so they'll have these kind of like, look, we have queer representation, just not the main characters, right? We know, of course, that a conglomerate like Disney is also looking at a global market, as all major film studios are, and sometimes it's, not that it says this, but its excuse is that it has to succeed in other markets, like in China and so on. But I think there has been progress, and the issue, of course, is that there isn't as much progress as A, we might like, and B, that they could afford, right? Like we might say, maybe you'll lose some money if you have more explicit queer representation, but if Disney can't afford it, then who can, right? If something as big as Disney can't, if they're always going to be playing it safe, that seems sort of, doesn't say much about what mainstream media will do. But like I said, one of the themes in my book is about how does media culture change? And it's not linear, and it's not in some gigantic leaps. It's sort of sometimes like, I don't know, like in bits and pieces. Some bits are bigger, some are smaller. Sometimes it goes backwards. But I think in terms of hope, there's always hope. It's just we also have to be realistic about, obviously the economic and political realities that we live in.
Hello. Thanks for such a wonderful and exciting talk.
Thank you.
I think anytime I'm thinking about queer media these days, my mind gravitates towards sort of influencer culture. And I think that really complicates these questions of production and representation. So I was interested in how, if you were to expand this further, I guess, you would factor in the kind of content where the queer person is the content, like on TikTok or YouTube, into this sort of analysis?
That's a great question. I think one of the great things about that scenario is that the producer has so much more control, right, over both what they're producing, because they're writing it, but also their distribution. So they're not sort of reliant on, I have to make content appealing enough such that I can, sell it or get someone to distribute it for free, because you have your, like you say, your sort of TikTok or your Instagram account that you can just do it on. At the same time, it's really hard to, and I'm sorry to use this term, but it's really hard to monetize. So very, very few social media influencers can actually make a living just off being an influencer, right? Like we see super successful people, but mostly I think, you know, even the people who are moderately successful, I feel like are more in the tens or hundreds of thousands of followers rather than the millions or tens of millions. So if we're looking for a model of sustained LGBTQ production at a particular scale, I wouldn't say that that would be a significant factor. But if we're looking at what is the range of LGBTQ content being produced, then this is a really important area as well. I'd say it's sort of, I'm thinking about my diagram, like it falls into the mass media because it's mass circulated, but with like low economic capital usually, but potentially with large audiences and potentially being able to move into like much larger audiences and much larger capital if things go viral. So I was just teaching an article about Lil Nas X, who I knew from Old Town Road, but I didn't realize that that he was first on TikTok, that's how he got his sort of, you know, I guess, big break. And so there are these instances that show the sort of multiple kinds of spheres of production that are going on. And certainly I haven't in this book talked about influencer culture, so that's a gap that I'm happy that someone like you is addressing.
Thank you.
Sorry. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I just have a question about what do you think of the queer baiting in the contemporary media production? Because like there's a lot of production that we know that they are performed by the non-queer actors and it's non-queer characters, but like for the profits issues, their marketing strategies, they use marketing strategies to pretend that they are queer and to do queer baiting. And how do you think that it's gonna impact the future mainstream representation of the LGBTQ community?
Thank you. And yeah, queer baiting is also something I'm quite interested in. I think that in one way, queer baiting illustrates the power of queer fandom, right? It illustrates the fact that it's no longer stigmatized. In fact, it's something that many mainstream media producers want to appeal to. They want people to think, oh, maybe something queer is going to happen, even if it's not going to happen, because it will bring audiences. But at another level, of course, it's not satisfactory, because part of what's also going on is they're not delivering on either canonical queer characters or the characters are queer, but the storyline doesn't really go anywhere, or they kill one of them and so on, right? So that lack of satisfactory narrative is also a reflection that queer baiting occurs in a context where there is still homophobic viewership. There are still viewers who would not accept that storyline. Or if, I don't know what kind of fandoms you're referring to, but for example, in a whole swath of like K-pop, for example, you know, in boy bands and girl bands, there seems to be very explicit kinds of strategies to queer bait people who would like to imagine the singers as maybe queer or, you know, at least into each other a little bit. So those aren't like scripted narratives, but it's still a sort of queer baiting phenomenon. So yeah, I think that it's problematic, but sometimes I'm like, yeah, like it shows where we are now, that it's queer baiting and not sort of denying. I mentioned Buffy, but I had mentioned this to the students last night as well. My other 90s fandom was Xena Warrior Princess. Xena lives forever. Forget the last episode, she's not dead. Sorry, spoilers, but it's been, whatever, 20 years. And that was also a show that, at the time, no one would call it queer baiting because none of the fans expected that a network show could have two lead characters be in a same-sex relationship. So we just sort of watched, imagining the relationship or reading fan fiction. But the producers were careful to not alienate viewers who wanted to see that. There was sort of selective commenting that acknowledged the queer fans, but didn't confirm queerness for the most part, although Lucy Lawless later on gave some interviews saying, yeah, actually, I think she was. So we go from, that to now where people are trying to make you think the characters are queer. So that's kind of progress, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess, yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering what you think the impact of a show like The White Lotus, for example, which is like an ensemble show. There's lots of stories, lots of characters, but it does feature like openly gay characters and gay relationships. Season 1 there's a gay character. Season 2 there's a closeted lesbian character. But also the showrunner and the writer is openly bisexual, so he brings sort of a queer sensibility to the thing. So do you think that what do you think the impact of that is on, because White Lotus is hugely successful. It's it's award-winning, commercially successful. Season 3 is in production, so it's not suffering the stigma that something that's more exclusively queer has. Do you think that helps enter the mainstream, or it sort of limits the impact by making it part of a larger ensemble?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a role for those shows. There are so many ensemble shows now that have at least one queer character, often more than one. Sometimes, I feel like thinking back, Grey's Anatomy was a good early example where it wasn't just the one gay character. They had enough queer characters that, two of them could be in a relationship. Although I think one of them then lost a leg, but she didn't die at least, right? So that's progress. And like you say, some of these ensemble shows are very well regarded. I mean, one of the shows that people say is the best show of all time, The Wire, very early on, had Omar, who is a gay man. That was a great character. And that, what was it, 1990s, 2000s? That's pretty early, right? So there are prestige shows, and there have been prestige shows that have these regular characters who aren't the main characters. But still, right, the argument is that there's a difference when the character is the protagonist or not the protagonist. And when they're the protagonist, part of it is that, yeah, we can see ourselves in other characters as well, but there's something different about being the main character, being the hero or the heroine of the show. The second thing, of course, is that typically the main character doesn't die. So one of the issues about the sort of bloodbath, the lesbian bloodbath of 2016, is that all these queer characters who were regular characters but not the protagonists got killed off. But the straight, mainly white male characters stayed because they were the protagonists. So, people say they have plot armor, that Rick Grimes won't die on The Walking Dead. And so it's also important to have shows like that where the main character is queer. And I think that we have those shows. It's just, as I mentioned, and others have mentioned, there's also been a bunch of cancellations, which is problematic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh,
We've got a question from the internet.
Okay.
Speaking of convergence culture, someone asks, content like Pose, featuring lead trans characters in New York City during the 1990s, introduced lots of people like myself to ballroom culture and LGBTQ stories related to the AIDS crisis. The question is about the relationship between narratives of grief and pain around trans lives and trans experiences, and the role that those play in attracting audiences. Are trans characters with lots of grief and pain the main way that media tell trans stories and attract mainstream audiences?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I'm not an expert on trans narratives, but first I just also want to go back to a point that the questioner before was making about having showrunners who were queer, like for White Lotus. So Pose, the showrunner is Ryan Murphy, who before that had made Glee, and Glee, of course, with all of its problems, was also a fairly early show that had lots of gay characters, some of whom were enough to have relationships. And Glee, of course, was a show that wasn't completely sort of about tragic queers as well. So in terms of Pose, yes, having it sort of set during the AIDS crisis and having a lot of grief and pain, that is part of stories that need to be told. The question we want to ask is, if you look at the landscape of trans representation, is that all there is, or is that the dominant storyline? I'm not sure. I don't think so now. And especially if you combine it with reality television, which I'm also not an expert on, but there are a lot of reality shows that are centered on trans people who are, then if it's a reality show, you are the protagonist of your own life, right? And if you combine that, then I would say maybe the trans representation landscape is more complex now.
Hi, sorry to monopolize the mic again, but I just wanted to sort of riff off of the topic of like queer baiting and having queer characters as sort of like side characters. To what extent that sort of applies to the marketability of these shows worldwide? As you said earlier, like the boys love movement in China is like heavily censored and vilified. And so I just wanted to know like your thoughts on a show like Sense8, for example, where like there's so many different types of people, and like they're produced like all over the world, but also have these like very integral queer characters. To what extent are those shows like less sort of censored in international media where queerness is not as accepted widely?
Yeah, again, I'm not an expert on sort of global queer media, but I think it depends on the show, and it depends on which markets it's being distributed to. Sense8, my sense of Sense8 is that it did have a global viewership and a very passionate one. That's why it got like the movie to wrap up after the show was cancelled. But it's not on a scale of what Netflix would consider its like top shows. And so when you're sort of aiming for a lower level of, when the bar for success is lower, then it seems like there could be more queer content that doesn't get cut. But also, honestly, Sense8 was made in a different era. Like streaming now is so, there seems to be much less room for the sort of quirky show that has never been done before, right? In favor of, like I said, The Rings of Power, which I made myself watch, but it was like there. Citadel, these kinds of like blockbuster. I even watched that Gal Gadot, what's it called? Shadow of, where she's like a secret agent because of Wonder Woman on Netflix, and it was not good. What's it called? Heart of Stone? Yeah. Where that's like a fairly standard action film with a big budget, with a person that can draw audiences from her previous movies, but it's no longer the kind of programming that Netflix and Amazon would greenlight. So I'm sort of pessimistic, even though we have some examples as recently as Sense8, right? But then Sense8 feels kind of old.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. I don't know which way to look.
Sure, I'll.
Okay.
So when we talk about cancel your gays, disproportionately affecting women queer media over gay media, which seems to survive more often, you mentioned partially due to the audience of straight women that it attracts. I was just wondering if you have any insight on why straight women are more drawn to media centered around gay men, but not queer women.
Yeah, this is something that people have been debating since the earliest days of slash fandom. So back to the original Star Wars series in the 1966 to 69, and Henry Jenkins obviously wrote about this in Textual Approaches and others as well, Camille Bacon-Smith. Why, why are straight women A, writing about gay men's relationships, but B, also reading about it and being really into it? Again, that's not my area of expertise, but some people have said, well, it's because if you like men, what better than to have even more men in like a sort of sexual fantasy? And B, the ways that those relationships were portrayed in fan fiction were different forms of masculinity that many straight women preferred. And then if you are thinking about, if we're looking at sort of contemporary television series that feature gay men, I feel like a lot of those depictions are a kind of, what people in talking about East Asia have called soft masculinity, right? Like they talk about their feelings. They're not like super violent. They're sort of a kinder, gentler masculinity, but they're still men, right? It's not like they're actually trans characters. They're still gay men. So that offers a lot of the same kinds of things that people had speculated that slash gay male fan fiction, why that appealed to women as well. But again, I'm just sort of channeling other people's work on this. Oh, and you also asked, but why aren't they attracted to narratives about queer women? I don't know, maybe because they're, wanting to imagine men in sexual situations rather than women. Why, I don't know, but,
Okay, yeah. So I had more of a question about, as consumers, what can we do to really make sure that queer media is still being representative of like our desires and what we want to see being represented? Because as we've discussed before, cancel the gays seems to be a very prominent thing that's upcoming. What can we do to either A, like make sure that this doesn't happen, or B, put pressure where pressure needs to be put? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as a fan who has seen many of my shows cancelled, I have thought about this a lot. I mean, on the one hand, there is the traditional forms of fan activism that are very time-consuming and that often yield very little. Like for every fan campaign that has some measure of success, there are like 100 that fail, despite all of the efforts and despite doing the same things, like trying to trend things on Twitter and thinking up creative ways to get the executives' attention, like sending, huge bags of peanuts or whatever, things like that. So, sometimes other fans are like, we shouldn't be spending our energy on these efforts. What else should we be doing? Well, unfortunately, if you look at it depends on what kind of media we would be happy with. So if we're happy with web series, like the shows on Open TV, Amar Christian's site, go there and support it, like pay the subscription fees. For a long time, I read Autostraddle without subscribing, and then I was like, if even I am not subscribing, what does that say about the lack of support for independent queer media? And the subscriptions were cheap. It was like $40 for a year. I was like, I can afford $40 a year, right? So we can support independent queer media by subscribing. Will that get us the level of a show that would be on Netflix? No. But it will, I think, support the queer producers. Remember, there are people behind these shows, right? It offers a measure of support for those producers who can, via Queer Relay, maybe move on to other things. And so they might not end up producing the next big queer show, but their sort of general success in the field of cultural production, I think, is also important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I think we seem to have run through questions, and so with that, I think we'll bring the evening to a close. I have a small gift as a token of our appreciation. I mean, there are things inside it too.
Thank you. Should I look inside?
I mean, if you want.
Nothing scary.
Nothing scary, I promise.
Oh, yeah, a poster.
Yeah. So with that, thank you all for joining us here in person and on the live stream. And please join me in once again thanking our Attallah lecturer for 2023, Professor Eve Ng.